Welcome to Life Stories, where we share unforgettable tales of courage, sacrifice, and love that remind us of the beauty in everyday life. Today, we bring you the story of James Carter, a man who lived a life of quiet strength, fighting battles that no one could see, and making sacrifices that would change the lives of many. His legacy was hidden, known only to a few. But today, his truth will be revealed. Join us as we explore life that defied expectations and taught us all the true meaning of love and impact. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. It was a quiet day at the cemetery. A subtle breeze blew through the tall trees, rustling the leaves as the crowd gathered solemnly around the freshly dug grave. People murmured among themselves, exchanging quiet pleasantries, but the air was thick with grief and respect. This was not a crowd full of strangers. Many knew the man they had come to mourn, James Carter. A beloved community figure, his name had been etched into the polished black headstone in front of us. And the inscription read simply, "A life of service and sacrifice." It was all anyone could say about James. He had given so much to others. And now, he was gone. But there, at the edge of the crowd, stood an elderly woman who seemed so out of place. Dressed modestly in a deep green dress, her silver hair neatly tucked beneath a simple hat. She stood alone, clutching a single red rose. Her gaze was steady, but there was a weight in her eyes, an unspoken sorrow, that made it clear she was carrying something much deeper than grief. She didn't belong to the circle of close family or old friends who were chatting softly near the front. No one paid much attention to her. And yet, in her silence, there was something that commanded respect. The ceremony continued, and people turned their focus to the pastor as he concluded his prayer. The moment stretched on, but the woman remained at the back, observing with quiet dignity. Then, as the last words of the prayer hung in the air, she stepped forward. Her movements were deliberate, each step slow, yet filled with purpose. The mourners parted to make way for her, and the crunch of gravel under her shoes was the only sound that broke the quiet. When she reached the front, she paused for a moment, her eyes lingering on the polished casket that rested before her. The quiet murmur of the crowd faded as she turned to face them. She placed the rose gently on the casket, then addressed the crowd, her voice steady, yet carrying a weight that caught everyone's attention. "My name is Eleanor Washington," she began, her voice clear and composed. "And I doubt many of you know me. But I knew James better than anyone here." A ripple of surprise swept through the crowd. People exchanged confused glances, brows furrowed. How could this woman, who appeared so distant from the man they had all come to honor, claim such a deep connection to him? Was she a relative? A close friend they had never heard of? Eleanor's gaze swept over the sea of faces, her expression calm but resolute. "Before this day is over," she continued, her voice quiet but firm, "you will understand why I'm here. And you will understand the James Carter most of you never knew." Her words hung in the air, thick with an unspoken promise. There was a deep sense of mystery in her presence now. Who was this woman? What did she know that none of them had ever heard about James? She took a deep breath, drawing the crowd in with the gravity of her presence. "I met James 50 years ago," she began, her voice softening as she looked into the distance, as if the memories were unfolding before her. "It wasn't here, in this town, but in Birmingham, Alabama, a time when people like me weren't welcome in places like this." The crowd leaned in slightly, intrigued. Eleanor's tone shifted slightly, mixing both pride and pain. "James was just a young man then," she continued, full of fire and ambition. "He worked as a teacher. But his heart was in the civil rights movement. That's where we crossed paths, on the steps of a church, organizing sit-ins and protests." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The James they knew, the kind, polished philanthropist, had never spoken of such struggles. No one had known about his involvement in the fight for justice. They had seen him as a man who quietly helped others. But this was something different. Eleanor allowed the weight of her words to settle in the air. The tension was palpable as the crowd struggled to reconcile the image they had of James with the person Eleanor was describing. "He wasn't afraid to stand beside me," she said, her voice unwavering, even when it meant losing his job, when it meant facing threats. He didn't care about any of that. He cared about doing what was right. And for that, they tried to break him. But he never backed down. She paused, her hand trembling slightly as she adjusted the hat perched on her head. We weren't just comrades in the fight for justice. Eleanor continued, her voice softening. We were friends. No, more than that. We became family. When the world seemed determined to tear us apart, he was there for me. When I lost my sister to the violence of those times, it was James who stood by me, giving me strength when I had none left to give. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. What Eleanor was describing, the deep bond between them, was something they could hardly reconcile with the polished image of James they had known. He had never spoken of his struggles. He had never shared the stories of his sacrifices. But here was this woman, telling a truth none of them had ever imagined. He was there for me. Eleanor continued, her voice barely above a whisper. And I was there for him when he had to rebuild his life after being ostracized by his own community. We shared meals. We shared stories. We shared tears. He called me his sister in every way that mattered, even when it wasn't safe for him to say it out loud. Eleanor's gaze fell on the casket again. And for a moment, she simply stood there, as if the weight of the memory was too much to carry. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, gathering herself. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the realization that the man they had come to mourn had led a life few of them could truly understand. But Eleanor wasn't done yet. She had more to share. And as she prepared to speak again, the crowd grew even quieter, knowing that what she was about to reveal would change everything they thought they knew about James Carter. Eleanor took a deep breath, the weight of her emotions settling into her chest. She looked down at the grave again, her hands tightening around the red rose that she had placed so gently upon the casket moments before. It seemed almost impossible that the man she had known, this strong, determined, and fiercely compassionate person, could be reduced to nothing more than a name on a tombstone. And yet, here they were, standing in silence, trying to understand who James Carter had truly been. She drew herself upright, steeling her heart, her voice, steady but laced with an undercurrent of grief, carried into the air. What I'm telling you today isn't just about the past, she said, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. It's about the man James Carter became because of those struggles. There was a shift in the air. Everyone, it seemed, was hanging on her every word. They were beginning to realize that this wasn't just about remembering a man they thought they knew, but understanding the depth of the man's life, what had shaped him, what he had fought for, and what he had sacrificed along the way. Eleanor took a moment to look at the faces in front of her. A few people were already dabbing their eyes, but most were still locked in a mixture of confusion and curiosity. They couldn't yet grasp what she was saying, couldn't fully appreciate the depth of the story she was weaving. James's fight, she continued, her voice firming as she spoke, wasn't just something he did in his youth. It was a battle that lasted throughout his life. And it left marks on him, marks that most of you will never see. A hushed silence fell over the crowd, the air thick with anticipation. Eleanor's eyes seemed to pierce through the layers of polite mourning. She wasn't here to flatter James or share half-truths. She was here to tell the real story, the one that had been hidden for so long. In 1967, James lost his job, she said, her voice steady but edged with a quiet sorrow. He had gone to Selma to march for justice, to demand equality, and for that, they fired him. The school board called it unbecoming conduct, but we all knew the truth, it was retribution. A gasp rippled through the crowd. They had never heard of this. The James they knew had been a philanthropist, a quiet helper to those in need. But not this man, this activist. This fighter who had stood up against a broken system, even if it meant losing everything. Eleanor's gaze darkened with the weight of the memory. James didn't tell anyone here about that, she said softly, because he didn't want pity. He didn't want anyone to see him as a martyr. He simply packed up what little he had, moved to a small one-bedroom house on the south side of Birmingham, and kept going. He scraped by on tutoring gigs, never once abandoning the fight. She paused, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her hat again, this time with a sense of finality, as though she had crossed into a new chapter of the story she was telling. Her words grew quieter, yet no less powerful. And when my house was firebombed in retaliation for hosting meetings, it was James who showed up in the middle of the night with his car. He drove me and my 2 nephews to safety. Without hesitation. He knew full well the risks he was taking. But he didn't care. That's who James was. The crowd stood still, taking in the enormity of what Eleanor had just shared. How many had thought they knew James? How many had admired him for his charitable work, his generosity, his quiet strength? Yet they had no idea what lay beneath that polished surface. He hadn't just been a man of public goodwill. He had been a man of deep, unspoken sacrifices, each one taking a toll on his soul. Eleanor's voice softened, but the intensity was still there. James never wore his struggles like a badge. She continued. He never spoke about them. He didn't want to be celebrated for what he had endured. But I'm here today to make sure you know the truth. To make sure you understand that the man you think you knew wasn't just a polished philanthropist in a tailored suit. He was a man who walked through fire. Again and again. For the people he cared about. For me. For all of us. The words hung in the air. Heavy and profound. There was an undeniable truth to them. One that the mourners were only now beginning to absorb. As the silence stretched on, Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She held it up for all to see. This, she said, her voice breaking slightly with emotion, is a letter that James wrote to me in 1972. I want to read you just one part. She carefully unfolded the letter, her hands shaking as she did. As she began to read, her voice trembled with the weight of each word. But it was clear. Eleanor, you are the sister I chose when life gave me none. We have shared burdens no one should bear. But I would carry them again for you without question. You remind me every day that love is not about blood. It's about who shows up when the world turns its back. Her voice cracked on the last line. She paused, closing her eyes for a moment to gather herself. Before continuing, that's who James was, she said, folding the letter carefully and placing it back in her purse. Not the man who stood in front of you today, but the man who was willing to do anything for those he loved. Who never turned his back on anyone, even when it cost him everything. The crowd, once stiff and uncertain, shifted uncomfortably. Many had tears in their eyes now. Some were looking at the ground, ashamed of how little they had truly known about James Carter. They had seen his public face, but they hadn't understood the depths of his private sacrifices. And now, that truth was unfolding before them. Irrevocably, Eleanor's eyes scanned the crowd once more, letting the silence settle for a moment. Then, she spoke again, her voice steady, though still filled with emotion. And how many of you here knew any of this? She asked, her gaze daring anyone to look away. How many of you cared enough to ask? Her question hung in the air, challenging them to reflect on their own relationships, on their own understanding of the people around them. How often do we look at someone and think we know them, without ever truly knowing the hidden parts of their lives? How many times do we fail to ask the questions that would bring us closer to the truth? As Eleanor let the question linger, the air around the crowd seemed to grow heavier. The truth she was revealing was not just about James, but about life itself, the sacrifices that go unnoticed, the quiet strength that often goes unappreciated. It was a lesson not just for those who had come to mourn, but for all of us, as we seek to understand the people we hold dear. As the last words echoed into the heavy silence, Eleanor took one final, steadying breath. The crowd around her was still, each person lost in thought, processing the depth of what they had just learned. The man they had thought they knew, James Carter, wasn't just a man of charity or influence, he was a fighter, a friend, and a father who had sacrificed more than any of them could have imagined. The air around the grave seemed to shift, as though the very earth beneath their feet had absorbed the weight of the truth Eleanor had shared. The mourners, once distant and formal, now approached her one by one. Some offered words of gratitude. Some simply nodded, while others wiped away the tears that had begun to flow freely. It was as if they had been granted a glimpse into a life they had missed. A life that had always been just out of reach. Eleanor stood there, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped a stray tear from her cheek. She had done what she came here to do. She had ensured that James's real legacy, his love, his sacrifices, his impact on the world, would not be lost in the dust of time. And as the crowd began to disperse, many lingering by the grave, speaking in hushed tones, she knew that the lessons of this day would stay with them long after they left. "Remember this," Eleanor said softly, her voice breaking through the soft rustle of the leaves. "The true measure of a person is not found in the things they leave behind, but in the lives they touch." James never cared about accolades. He only cared about making a difference. And with that, she turned, walking away from the grave, knowing that James's story would live on in the hearts of those who had gathered to remember him. If this story moved you, let it remind you that kindness and sacrifice often go unseen but never unnoticed. If you found meaning in this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more life stories that inspire and touch the heart.